start, I would like really to thank you for taking interest in this session. I would also like to thank the North Africa Dreaming team for organizing this event. So today's session is going to be about the latest addition to the Wire collection of LWCs, which is GraphQL. It's a very interesting topic. We're going to dive into it. So before we start, I would like to read to you some forward-looking statements. So just know that Salesforce is a publicly traded company. Please do not make any purchasing decisions on things you might see here today. So a little information about me. My name is Mohammed-Mahmoud Rhazzoul. I'm a technical consultant at Salesforce. I primarily work on B2B commerce cloud projects. I'm 5 times certified, and I'm 2 times accredited professional in the B2B cloud. And I've been in the ecosystem for a little over 2 years now. I'll just wait a bit for people to settle in. Okay, our agenda for today. We're going to start off by talking about the REST architecture and its drawbacks, because the drawbacks of REST are what made GraphQL be available. So then we're going to be talking about the GraphQL API, going to define it, look how to work with it, etc. And then we're going to talk about the GraphQL Wire adapter. And after that, we're going to jump into some code in a demo. So REST API suffers from 2 problems that we're going to be talking about, which are overfetching and underfetching. So I like to explain stuff by giving an example so we can understand. So imagine a scenario where we would like to create a card component, and this card component is going to be displaying the user's full name and age. Okay. So in a normal REST API scenario, the first thing you will do is that you're going to call your endpoint, right? And then after that, you're going to get a JSON response. And the JSON response is going to include the fields. You can't see the JSON response here, but we have a lot of fields here, and we're only interested in a certain number of fields. We're interested in the name and age. So we end up with a lot of fields that we're not going to be using. This poses some problems. The first problem you're going to run into are performance issues. So those are mostly noticed on the server side, because your server is going to end up requesting more fields than the ones you're going to need. And also, you have some bandwidth issues, because you have a lot of fields in your JSON. More fields means the JSON body is going to be bigger, so it's going to be a large JSON response. And this, for users with slow internet connection, it might be slow for them. So while I was learning about GraphQL, I came across this great analogy that explains it very well. So here, on the left side of the screen, we can see your traditional REST API call. So we are calling an endpoint called cheeseburger, and we get a normal cheeseburger, right? But on the right side here, we have a query. This is a GraphQL query. So as you can see here, we define the fields or the components in this example of what we want in our burger. So here we want the bun, lettuce, patty, bun and cheese. We skipped onions and tomatoes because we don't eat those. So the second problem we're going to talk about with REST API is underfetching. So what's underfetching? Let's take another example here, and let's say that we want to build another component, and we want to display the name, right, of the user and the address. Suppose we have the name and address in 2 different endpoints. So in a normal scenario, we're going to call your first endpoint, get information about that user, and then you're going to have to call another endpoint to get information about where they live. So basically, underfetching is having less data than you need, forcing you to make a second call to an endpoint. just before I move on to GraphQL, this doesn't mean that REST API is a bad architecture. No, it's not. It's a really good architecture that has proven its robustness with time. And just note that both REST API and GraphQL can coexist, which is the case for Salesforce. You have both APIs available for you to use. So enter GraphQL. So Facebook, back in 2012, they needed a way to fetch user data because they have a lot of data they need to fetch on the homepage. They need to get, for example, your friends, posts, things you're interested in. So in a REST API, they would need to do a lot of queries and endpoints. So they came with a solution. That's when they decided to start working on GraphQL. So they started working on it internally back in 2012. And when the solution was great, they decided to release it to the public in 2015. So unlike REST API, where you have multiple endpoints, for example, you will have an endpoint for accounts, you will have points for contacts, etc. In GraphQL, you only have a single endpoint that you query and you get information about any entity you want. So as we saw before, GraphQL gives you the ability to request only the fields you're interested in, okay? So you decide what you want and you only get that data. And finally, the Salesforce GraphQL API supports queries, which are read, and create, update, delete, which are mutations. So mutations are what are the GraphQL terminology for anything that modifies data. So updates, deletes, and creations are labeled as mutations in GraphQL terminology. Just know that the mutations were just added in the winter release of 24. So before we can only query, the mutation part was beta. So moving on. We're going to be inspecting a GraphQL API structure. So as we can see here on the screen, we have query big opportunities, which is the operation name for our query. This can be anything. So it has to be something, for example, descriptive. Okay? So on the second level, we have what we call the UI API family. So Salesforce has a lot of families of APIs, and in GraphQL, the UI API, in a Salesforce, the UI API family is what powers the Lightning experience. It's what makes you create records, delete records. It's what powers list views, related lists, etc. So it's what allows the creation of those records, objects, custom objects, etc. Okay. So this is, we specified the UI API family on the second level. This family is the only one exposed in the GraphQL. And then the second point is where we find here our S object we want to query on. So in this example, we want to query on the opportunity. If I were to query on accounts, I will replace that by accounts. And here we have our filters. So if we were to read this, I would like to query on opportunities. I only want the first 5 where the amount of those opportunities is greater than 500,000. So we can write like filters inside of our query. So when Salesforce tried to implement the GraphQL API, they went and implemented what we call the relay cursors connection specification. This is the standard specification. It's a bit confusing, but note that these two, they are what allow the pagination. They're what make the pagination possible, and they make it very efficient too. Okay, and then we're going to move on to the last part. This is where we specify the fields that we want to query. Okay, let's talk about the GraphQL Wire adapter. We've talked about GraphQL API, then we're going to talk now about the LWC Wire. So the first thing why this wire is impressive is that you get the ability to fetch records directly from your LWC, which wasn't the case before. If you were to fetch a lot of records from LWC, you always had to rely on Apex controllers. So you can do this with SQL-like queries that support filtering and data aggregation. And then the second impressive point about this wire is that it's built on top of Lightning Data Service. Now, if you don't know what Lightning Data Service is, it's what it takes. So, for example, if you're calling this wire, because it's built on top of LDS, you have sharing and FLS taken into consideration by default. So if a user doesn't have access to a record, they're not going to get that record back. If they don't have access, read access to a field, they're not going to be able to read what's inside that field. And the second important point for wires that use Lightning Data Service is the caching mechanism. So let's say we have a component. We just loaded, so the user just executed the query for the first time. So the wire is going to contact the GraphQL API server. If the user were to refresh that page again, they're going to be served directly from the cache, unless that data is changed from the server. And that's what's impressive about it. Also, if you have another component that uses the same wire, like the same query, that component can also get the result from the cache. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and imagine a use case where we need to create an app that displays North Africa Dreaming sessions with speakers and room details. So, for example, here we have multiple sessions that are available. By the way, if you're interested in Experience Cloud, there is a session that where Taha is going to talk about. He's going to talk about LWR sites. So we can discuss my payment after this. So the current solutions without the wire, without the GraphQL wire, first you decide maybe to implement what's available in the org. So you go with Aura components, but the problem with Aura is that they're not very efficient and they don't respect the modern web standards. So then you decide to go with LWC, which is more modern, right? Then you go with the existing wires. The problem is there is only a wire available for now that you can use, which is getRecord. But the problem with getRecord is that you need to know the ID of the records you're trying to fetch, and you can only get one record at a time, which is not what we want. And those wires are really efficient because they're built on Lightning Data Service. The only caveat to them is that they only get one record at a time, and you don't get, they only get one record at a time, and you need to know that ID for the ID for that record. Then the route we always go with are LWCs with Apex controllers. Then again, when you write an Apex controller, you need to write the test class for it. And then again, you don't really benefit from the same caching mechanism that are provided by Lightning Data Service. Sure, you have Aura enabled with cacheable equals true, but it's not the same caching mechanism as Lightning Data Service. So we're going to see here how to write GraphQL queries in LWC. So it's pretty straightforward. You start by importing GraphQL and JQL from the Lightning UI GraphQL API module. And then this is like your standard wire decorator. The first parameter is the adapter name. In our case, is going to be GraphQL. And then the second parameter is an object where you have query. And in this query, you write your query inside the GQL tag template literal. This part is very important. For the simple case that this is what tells Salesforce where your query lives inside your component. So when you deploy your code, some checks can be done behind the scenes, like reference integration, like org schema checks. So for example, if your query references a field that doesn't exist, Salesforce is going to throw an error telling you whatever field you're trying to reference doesn't exist. And also, down the road, your component is deployed. If an admin were to delete a field that's referenced in one of your queries, they're going to get an error telling them that whatever you're trying to delete is going to break the functioning of other components. You can also pass in some variables, and we can see here that we're using the $sign syntax, which means that this is a reactive property. We're going to jump in with demo with LWC recipes. Now, if you don't know LWC recipes, it's a GitHub repo that has examples, various examples with how you can achieve stuff with LWC, whether it's redirection, how to work with it, how to get records. And it's maintained by people that work at Salesforce. One of them is Philippe Ozil. Thank you for your work. This one is on the house, so it's fine. So I'm going to sit and try to show you how things work. Just 1 second. The time I log into my can you see the screen, or should I like zoom in? Is it okay for you back there? Perfect. So the first component we're going to talk about is the GraphQL contacts. Okay, we're going to go into our source code and try to inspect what it does. Give me 1 second. Perfect. So here, like we talked about earlier, we import JQL and GraphQL from this module, and inside your wire, you have your query, right? And you write your query inside of this tag template literal. So here our query name is getContacts. We're querying on the contacts objects, and those are the filters which we have in. So we want contacts where the picture field is not null, and we want only the first 5, and we want to order name ascendingly. These are the fields that we're trying to select. If you go in back here, we can see that when this wire runs, it gets us contacts that have pictures along with their title and their phone number. So let's look at a more interesting example where we want to work with variables. So here we have a search text box, and we can search, for example, for contacts maybe that start with the letter B, or they have B inside of their name. So let's go back here. Go inside GraphQL variables. Oh, okay. So same query again. We have a query called here search contacts, and it takes in a variable called search key, which is of type string. We are querying contacts where name like search key. So this is the variable we're passing into our query. We want the first 5, and then order name, order ascendingly. And then as a second parameter to that object, we're passing the variable. So if I go here, you can see that our variable will return search key, our search key. And the key always changes here. So we set in the search key whenever we type something. Also earlier, when I started the presentation, I talked about how GraphQL solves problems like underfetching. So underfetching is when you have to do 2 callouts to multiple endpoints. So the way it does this is that in your GraphQL query, you can query as much as objects as you want in a single one, and it only counts as in one API call. So let's go ahead and talk about the GraphQL multiple objects components. Okay, so we have a query called getAccounts and contacts, which the first query we have written here, we have account. We want to get the first 5 accounts, and then we can also query contact in the same way. And then if I need another S object, or if I'm interested in other information, I can also write this one here. And if you notice, the best thing about this is that you have your query, and you have the logic behind it on the same component. You don't have to go navigating between a class and an LWC to know what it does. So you have all your logic lives inside one component. Okay, the last thing we're going to see is the GraphQL pagination. So this is an example about pagination. Earlier I said that the edges and nodes are what makes pagination possible in a GraphQL environment. So we're going to go ahead and see that, pagination. Perfect. So we can see here our query is called paginated contacts. We have a dollar after, which is a string. We're going to talk about this later. And we have page size, which is an int. So page size is a constant here that's set as string. Okay. We want to query the contacts. We're going to talk about first and after. But what our query does is that it gets us our contacts ordered by name. So we're getting the name, page info. This is another thing that you can work with, which gives you, for example, information about the end cursor. So when we get our records, each record has a cursor. So a cursor is like, it tells it, it's just a specific, you can see it as an ID. So for example, what the end cursor points to the last record we have in our query. So you use this end cursor and you pass it again to your query and you tell it, hey, GraphQL, fetch me the records after the last cursor that we sent you. And first is just how you want to paginate. There is some pagination logic. We go back here, we can see that it's the same thing. So when I click on this, it's going to get me the cursor of the last record and pass it to the GraphQL variable, to the GraphQL query, sorry. And this will fetch us there. So I'm going to go back to the presentation now, and we can continue. So some key takeaways from this presentation is that GraphQL is a query language that allows your client to request data they need. The second talking point is that the LWC GraphQL Wire allows you to fetch your records directly from the database without having to rely on an Apex controller. Finally, Lightning Data Service, which is a fascinating framework, it provides you with powerful caching mechanism, and it takes sharing and checks also for sharing and field level security. There is a QR code if you'd like to scan it. It's going to take you to a quick document where you can find more information on how to learn more about GraphQL. You're going to have there are links to the official documentation, and there is also a link to a video done by Alba Rivas, which I find very interesting. It talks about GraphQL and LWC. It also does. It was a live session, so also the coding was live, and it was a really great starting point for me. And with that, I guess we reached the end of our session. I will be happy to take any questions from you. Yes, Georgi. I don't think, I tried to fetch records using both methods, but I haven't seen any performance differences, and I'm not sure if the documentation covers, for example, any ways to fetch records, etc. But when I was doing my tests, I found very little it was a very small difference in the milliseconds, so it wasn't like a great benchmark you can use. But all in all, I think it's 1-to-1 or something like that. Yes, Jed. Governor limits. As governor limits, when you talk about how many, for example, 50,000 rows, for example, right? That's what you're talking about. I am not sure about that, but I will look it up and come back to you. I don't want to give you something wrong. But as you know, like I said, you don't have the same, you're not going to hit the same governor limits, because when you work with GraphQL, you can put all your things you need. So for example, every ICE object you want to query in a single query, GraphQL query, and these count as one query at the end. Yes. Yes, there are. That's a good question. So as of now, Experience Cloud is not supported with GraphQL. So if you work with GraphQL, if you work primarily on Experience Cloud, which is the case, for example, for people that work in Commerce Cloud, GraphQL unfortunately is not supported. Yes. You're welcome. So this is a very tricky question for the simple fact that it depends on where the change happened, on where it happened. So if it happened inside Lightning experience, for example, if a user were to change the record directly from a record page or something, the Lightning Data Service gets notified that the record changed and it updates the cache. Whereas if that data changed directly from the server, then that's a whole another story. You need to refresh your GraphQL query, and there is an adapter for that that does it for you. Yes. You're welcome. Alvarivas? Yeah, it was back when it was in pilot. It wasn't even beta. Yeah. It Okay, it does support subqueries. They're supported, but however, for your second question, where you talked about the level of nesting, that I have no idea about. I'm sorry, but I can search for it and look it up. Also, so that's time. If you have any other questions, you can. If you have the swap card application, if you go to this session, there is a button. There's a live discussion button. I'll be checking that today and tomorrow. So if you have any questions throughout the day that might pop into you, so you can ask them on the live chat, or you can run into me if you find me in the lobby. You can ask me anything you want. And with that, we come to the end of our session. So thank you again.